Art is and always has been one of those most ambiguous of abstractions, seemingly impossible to tether to the most general of grounds. It is one of those rare concepts where one can be both sure of its objective existence and of the sheer subjectivity of its definition and understanding without being readily accused of linguistic homicide. An interesting element in most discussions of art is the emphasis on the meaning of the piece, with this sometimes absorbing the whole of the conversation. Be it movies, shows, music, paintings, video games, and so on, it seems as though to ask a million people the question, "What do you think of this?" is to receive a million different answers, if only slightly. From the imagery conjured up by a symphony to the intentions and perceptions of a character's motivations and actions, the so-called meaning of artistic works is often the subject of personal thought and friendly debate. This is often coupled with the consistent disregard for a creator or creator's own personal or intended interpretations. Many times the context in terms of when and where the particular piece was created will often go undiscussed or take up only a brief and usually passing part. Instead, the focus tends to be on what the people themselves discussing the art derive from it. Not to say that this is always the case or that considerations of the kinds described never take place in whole or in part, but what is worth observing here isn't this point in and of itself, rather that the idea of discussing for oneself the quote-unquote meaning of any given art piece is usually treated with passivity. Imagine applying this exercise elsewhere. Say you were driving down the road, approaching at high speeds the red light of a busy intersection, and suddenly took on a Socrates complex, and began to question the true, ontological meaning behind the color and symbolism of the red light. Now imagine you came to the conclusion that you were going to cut against the grain and interpret for yourself what the red light really means. The notable and hopefully obvious difference between this kind of personal interpretation and the artistic kind is outcome. When one attempts to attribute for oneself meaning behind art, the outcome can be an immaculate exercise of self-spelunking, a kind of personal insight and exploration that could give way to one of life's most brilliant experiences, introspective inquiry, something that for myself and many others has been and continues to be one of the greatest intellectual activities. So I'll have to be forgiven in becoming a little perturbed when someone claims to have done the job for me. Among those who fancy themselves the proud owner of the tallest ivory tower in the land, an irony which never seems to reach them at such high altitudes, sits many who claim to know, as a matter of fact, the one true interpretation of any and sometimes all works of art. A particular subgroup has coined for themselves the title Cult-ural Critic, or some variation thereof. Forged from the words and actions of people like Anita Sarkeesian and company, Dan Olson, Ian Danksin, and other contemporaries and associates in ideology, is an all too familiar intellectual double-edged sword. They offer relief from the strenuousness required in forming one's own opinion by asserting unto you, not sharing with you, a very important distinction to make, their own interpretations of almost all things artistic. In exchange for the wonderful gift of a brain vacation, you must accept the conclusions and judgments they derive from their divine revelations. It's quite plain to see in their common language the assertiveness of moral judgments and an attitude of implication. This film is racist. That video game is sexist. It seems phrases such as, in my opinion, or I think, etc., or at the very least an attitude or tone that would invoke the same sentiment is completely alien to these people. Sarkeesian in particular claims that everything is sexist, racist, and homophobic, and of course, to paraphrase, it must all be pointed out. An attempt at any sort of comment to the effect of, I think you're wrong, or I have a different opinion, is usually met with a barrage of labels and further assertions of moral judgment, as well as complete dismissal of the idea of being incorrect as even a remote possibility. However, on an occasion where dissent is far too large, and most can't muster mass application of their favorite smear, a cowardice not to be attributed to all of them, a more nuanced, if you could call it that, approach will be taken to try and justify the large-scale dismissal needed. One such example is Ian Danskin's series Why Are You So Angry?, wherein he creates an elementary textbook definition of a straw man he calls Angry Jack, in order to dismiss the arguments of dissent on the issue of Gamergate. Preying on most people's desire not to be publicly or otherwise branded with any kind of nasty label containing nasty implications, people of this stripe will often go on a tirade of extravagant proclamations with nary a foundation in reality or logical through-line in sight. Perhaps most bothersome and untruthful of these is the act of making empirical claims based on observations and personal opinions of fictional works. Dan Olson, for example, a YouTube culture critic, has a video wherein he claims that because the main character of the Transformers series is a, to use his words, douche, and does things in the movie such as using violence to vent anger, and because the main character is a man, that this is what most men are like and even strive to be like. Olson claims these attitudes and behaviors to be a part of male gaze, which he contextualizes in the beginning of this video as essentially the worldview of men, though the origin story of this conspiracy theory level concept is far more outrageous and admittedly hilarious, if only because some people take it seriously. So here we have someone who has watched some movies wherein he finds he doesn't like the main character, thinks of him many an awful thing, and comes to the rather sweeping revelation that this must be what most men are like, and strive to be like, and how they view the world, excluding himself, of course. Going beyond the astronomically massive piles of questions for this line of thinking, it appears to not have occurred to Olson that other people might have actually agreed with his assessment of the main character, in whole or in part, despite being born with the original sin of male genitalia, and may have enjoyed the movie in spite of the main character. But Olson could have been forgiven, if only a little, had he bothered to offer any kind of evidence for his empirical claim to know the thoughts and attitudes of most people who saw the Transformers movies while possessing a set of cock and balls. A survey, a study, even just one anecdote, there are no such things to be found within that video or its description. Instead, Olson and others like him assert their opinions as absolute facts and defend them not with evidence, but with the supposed implications of disagreement. And this is standard operating procedure against anyone who dare have their own interpretations of art. There are a lot of things where having a monopoly on meaning is desirable, such as the meaning of the red light at a busy intersection. Concepts where conformity is enforced to prevent disastrous outcome. Art is not among these concepts. Art can be amazing. No, perhaps I'll borrow from the cultural critics just this once and assert art is amazing, vibrant, thought-provoking, and so many more colorful adjectives. Indulging in movies, video games, music, or anything else you deem worthy enough to be called artistic can be, and for me at least, is one of the most, if not the most, beautiful undertakings life has to offer. But above all else, art is deeply personal, unique to each individual in its reciprocation, meaning, impact, and so much more. And that uniqueness has a value not worth ever sacrificing, especially not under the guise of moral purity. So to all of you out there who believe other people possessing their own interpretations of art to be equivalent to possessing their own interpretations of a red light, perhaps it's time you were the one to slam on the brakes.